in a small bustling town, where the streets were lined with old shops and the cries of traders echoed through the air, a young man named Daniel lived with a restless heart. He was not poor in the sense of lacking food or shelter, but his soul was consumed with greed and impatience. Every day he looked at the mansions on the hilltop, where the rich drove their cars and hosted lavish parties, and he longed for that life. He believed he was destined for greatness, but he was unwilling to work for it. Daniel had a girlfriend named Amara. She was gentle, graceful, and full of life. Her laughter carried warmth, and her kindness touched even strangers who barely knew her. But Daniel did not see her heart. He saw only opportunity. To him, Amara was a possession, a stepping stone, something he could use to achieve the wealth and status he craved. The thought had grown inside him like a seed planted in darkness. At first, it was only whispers in his mind, ideas that came and went. But as he mixed with certain men in the hidden corners of the town, that seed began to sprout. They spoke of wealth that came overnight, of rituals that required sacrifice, of powers that could grant gold, cars, and houses if only one had the courage to pay the price. Daniel listened, and his heart hardened. He became distant with Amara, but she did not notice at first. She thought he was stressed from job hunting, or weighed down by the struggles of life. She encouraged him, prayed for him, and even shared what little she had with him. She was proud to call him her man, and she imagined a future where they would rise together. But Daniel's future plans were darker than her dreams. He had visited a shrine in a remote village, far from the eyes of ordinary people. The priest, an old man with eyes like burning coals, welcomed him. The air in that place was heavy, and the ground seemed to pulse with something unseen. The priest told Daniel that wealth was possible, but nothing came free. A sacrifice was needed, not of animals or strangers, but of someone close, someone pure, someone whose life would mean something when snatched away. Daniel's heart raced, for he already knew the person who fit that description. Amara, her love, her loyalty, her innocence. All these were the very qualities the priest said the spirits desired. If Daniel brought her to the shrine, his wealth would overflow beyond measure. For days, he struggled with the thought, but greed is a fire that consumes quickly. He imagined himself driving cars through town, wearing gold watches, giving orders, and being respected. He compared that dream to the life he lived now, broke and mocked by friends who had already made their wealth through mysterious means. Soon the decision was made. He would sacrifice Amara. But fate, though silent, was already writing a different story. On the evening he planned to carry out his intentions, Amara had a strange feeling. She could not explain it, but her heart felt restless. That night, she dreamt of walking through a dark forest, where someone she loved was pushing her towards a pit. Just before she fell, a bright light appeared and pulled her back. She woke up sweating, confused, and shaken. She prayed about it, asking God for protection, not knowing that the very person she trusted most was the one plotting her doom. Daniel continued his preparations. He became unusually sweet, treating Amara with affection he had not shown in weeks. He offered to take her on a trip to the countryside, saying he wanted to spend time alone with her away from the noise of town. Amara, though still disturbed by her dream, accepted. She thought maybe he was trying to rekindle their bond. As they set out on the journey, Amara noticed strange things. Daniel was unusually quiet, and his eyes had a hardness she could not describe. The road grew lonelier as they drove further, with fewer houses and fewer people. The sun began to set, and shadows stretched across the land. A coldness filled the air, though it was not yet night. Amara's heart pounded. Something was wrong. She asked Daniel where they were going, but he gave vague answers, brushing her questions aside. Finally, they arrived at a thick forest path. Daniel told her to get out of the car, saying he wanted to show her something. She hesitated, but his tone was firm. Against her better judgment, she followed him. The deeper they went into the woods, the more uneasy she became. The trees closed in, and the sounds of birds and insects faded into an unnatural silence. She felt as if unseen eyes were watching her. Daniel walked ahead, carrying a small bag he had refused to let her touch. Suddenly, they entered a clearing. In the center stood a strange structure made of stones and old wood, blackened by fire. The air smelled of ash and decay. Amara's body trembled, and she turned to look at Daniel. His face was different, cold, determined, and unrecognizable. In that moment, the truth dawned on her. She was not there for love. She was there for sacrifice. Her knees weakened, but before she could react, the ground beneath her seemed to shift. A wind rose, swirling around them, carrying whispers that chilled her soul. The priest emerged from the shadows, his staff glowing faintly. He welcomed Daniel, his voice deep and otherworldly. Amara's heart screamed, but her mouth could not form words. Fear paralyzed her. She realized she was trapped in the very nightmare she had dreamt of days before. And as Daniel stepped forward, preparing to hand her over, something unseen stirred in the air. The spirits were awake, and they were watching. The The night was about to unfold in ways neither Daniel nor Amara could have ever imagined. The clearing was heavy with silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees. The shrine stood like a wound in the forest, a place that did not belong to the living. Its stones bore stains that no rain could wash away, and the ground was hardened with the memory of countless sacrifices. The priest, cloaked in darkness, raised his staff toward the heavens. His eyes glowed with the hunger of spirits that lingered unseen, spirits that demanded life in exchange for wealth. Daniel's heartbeat was steady, almost unnaturally calm. The decision had been made, and in his mind there was no turning back. He believed that he was about to cross the final threshold between poverty and abundance, between shame and power. His imagination already painted pictures of mansions, cars, and endless luxuries. To him, Amara was no longer a lover, but a key. Her life was the price, her blood the seal. But Amara trembled. Her body refused to move, as if the earth itself had gripped her ankles. Her dream, the one she had brushed aside, replayed in her mind. She remembered the pit, the betrayal, and the light that pulled her back. Now it all made sense. The person she trusted, the man she loved, had led her into the hands of death. The priest beckoned Daniel forward. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of ancient authority. He instructed Daniel to bring the girl to the center of the shrine, to bind her there where the spirits could feast on her life. Daniel moved toward Amara, his eyes fixed and cold, yet a faint shadow of hesitation flickered across his face. For a moment, he remembered her smile, her kindness, the countless ways she had stood by him when others mocked his poverty. But greed is a master that demands loyalty. He forced the memories aside and reached for her. The wind grew stronger. The trees around the clearing began to sway violently, though no storm clouds gathered in the sky. A deep, unsettling sound rumbled beneath the ground, like drums echoing from the underworld. The priest chanted, his words strange and sharp, summoning powers older than the forest itself. Amara's body shook, but her spirit cried silently for deliverance. In that moment of despair, she closed her eyes, and though she spoke no words aloud, her heart called upon the God she had always trusted. She begged for life, for rescue, for justice. As Daniel attempted to force her to the center of the shrine, a sudden crack split the air. It was as if lightning had struck without warning, though no flash could be seen. The ground trembled violently, throwing Daniel back. Amara fell to her knees, but the unseen force held her untouched. The priest's chant faltered, and his glowing eyes widened in shock. The spirits had responded, but not in the way Daniel expected. A dark shadow rose from the shrine, swirling like smoke but denser, heavier, filled with eyes that glowed red. The presence was suffocating, and the temperature in the clearing dropped as if winter had descended in an instant. The priest fell prostrate before the shadow, whispering words of reverence, while Daniel's breath caught in his chest. The shadow spoke, its voice echoing inside every skull, reverberating through bone and marrow. It reminded Daniel of the agreement, of the price that must be paid, of the wealth he had demanded. But then it added something that froze him to the core. The spirits did not care whose blood was spilled, as long as it was close, pure, and meaningful. If Daniel could not complete the task, the covenant would still demand a soul his own. Daniel's heart stopped. The very path he had chosen now turned back on him. The priest, regaining his composure, urged Daniel to finish the sacrifice quickly. But Daniel's hands trembled. The fear of losing his own life battled against the greed that still whispered promises of riches. He looked at Amara, fragile and shaken, yet strangely shielded by an invisible force. Something about her presence in that moment terrified him more than the spirits themselves. The shadow grew restless, swirling violently. The air became unbearable, pressing down on everyone in the clearing. Daniel staggered to his feet, torn between running and obeying. He took a step toward Amara, but the ground shook again, this time so violently that the shrine itself cracked. Pieces of stone fell, and the air filled with the smell of burning earth. Amara lifted her head, her eyes wide but unbroken. Though she did not speak, there was a strange strength about her, a light that seemed to resist the darkness. Daniel saw it, and fear clawed at his heart. He realized she was not as powerless as he thought. Someone was standing with her. The priest shouted at Daniel, his voice desperate, warning him that the spirits would not wait forever. The decision had to be made. Daniel's mind raced. If he pushed forward, he might succeed and gain the wealth he sought. But if he failed, his own life would be taken instead. And if he fled, the wrath of the spirits might follow him wherever he went. The clearing grew darker, the spirits pressing closer. Amara's silent prayers clashed with the chants of the priest. Daniel was caught between two forces, one pulling him into destruction, the other offering a narrow path of escape, but at the cost of his greed. He stood frozen, sweat pouring down his face, as the shadow stretched its hands toward him. The spirits had grown impatient. They had smelled blood, and they demanded their due. In that moment, Daniel realized that the line between hunter and prey had vanished. The one who had planned to betray was now standing on the edge of being devoured. The forest fell silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for the decision that would decide whose blood would seal the ritual. And as Daniel stepped forward once more, the night split open with a scream, not from Amara, but from the depths of the earth itself. The real sacrifice had only just begun. The scream that tore from the depths of the earth did not belong to man or beast. It was a sound that seemed to peel the air apart, a cry that carried the weight of countless trapped souls. The clearing quaked under its power, and the trees bent as though bowing to a force greater than themselves. Daniel froze, his courage draining away like water from a broken jar. The shrine before him shuddered, its stones splitting further as if something beneath longed to break free. The priest, though practiced in darkness, staggered backward in fear. Even he had not expected the spirits to rise with such fury. The shadow thickened, forming shapes that were both human and monstrous. Eyes multiplied in the smoke, each glaring at Daniel with hunger. Their whispers filled his head, overlapping, chaotic, and unbearable. They reminded him that blood was the price, that the sacrifice had not been completed, that the covenant was broken by hesitation. Their anger was not only at delay, but at insult. Daniel had dared to bring them a soul that resisted, one shielded by a greater power. Amara knelt on the ground, trembling, but her spirit blazed with unseen light. Though her lips were silent, her heart continued to pray. The same dream that had once frightened her now returned to her memory, not as a warning, but as a promise. She recalled the hand of light, pulling her from the pit, and her fear began to transform into a strange calm. Daniel, however, was unraveling. He had thought himself the hunter, the master of destiny, the one who would walk away with riches. Yet now he felt the gaze of death upon him. He remembered the priest's first warning, that the spirits demanded a life close to him, a life bound with his own. If he could not deliver Amara, then only his blood would suffice. The priest's chants grew louder, desperate, as though trying to control the chaos. He urged Daniel to seize Amara, to bind her before the spirits chose for themselves. But Daniel's body refused to move. His legs were heavy, his chest constricted, and his vision blurred. Fear had shackled him. The shadow surged toward him, tendrils of darkness reaching for his face, his chest, his very soul. He staggered back, clawing at the air, but there was nowhere to run. The spirits had surrounded the clearing. Escape was no longer an option. And then, something happened that neither Daniel nor the priest had foreseen. The wind that had carried only whispers of death suddenly shifted. From above, a faint glow broke through the canopy of trees. It was not bright, not overwhelming, but steady and pure, like a candle defying the night. It fell upon Amara, bathing her in a soft radiance. The shadow hissed and recoiled, shrinking away from the light as though burned. The priest cried out in frustration. He recognized it instantly. It was protection, the kind that no dark covenant could penetrate. Amara had been shielded by a power greater than rituals, greater than sacrifices. The spirits could not touch her. Daniel's heart sank. The very person he had chosen as an offering was untouchable. His plan was crumbling, and the price was circling back to him. The shadow turned its gaze fully upon him now, and its whispers grew sharp, accusing, merciless. It told him that greed had brought him here, that betrayal had marked him, and that his own life was now the only fitting payment. Daniel fell to his knees, weeping silently, though no tears could wash away the weight of his choices. The ground split further, and from the cracks, hands clawed upward, skeletal, ghostly, yet strong. They reached for Daniel, wrapping around his ankles, his wrists, dragging him toward the shrine. He screamed, but no sound carried far. The forest itself seemed to swallow his cries. Amara watched, horrified, yet she could not move. The light around her held her in place, not to bind, but to protect. She realized then that she was only a witness to what had been destined. The one who planned evil had become the offering. The priest tried to intervene, raising his staff to shield Daniel, but the spirits were beyond his control now. They were angry not just at the broken covenant, but at the arrogance of both man and priest. They had been mocked, delayed, and challenged by a power they despised. Their hunger demanded satisfaction, and Daniel was the feast. His body was dragged toward the altar stone. He clawed at the earth, leaving trails in the dirt, his nails breaking, his voice hoarse from screaming. He called for mercy, but mercy was not the language of the spirits. The light grew brighter around Amara, forcing the shadow back. She could see Daniel's face, twisted in terror, a mirror of the betrayal he had once planned for her. The realization struck her with bitter clarity. Greed does not only destroy the victim, it consumes the one who feeds it. The priest, realizing the ritual was collapsing, fled into the forest. His chant ceased, and his figure vanished into the darkness, abandoning the man he had once guided. Alone, Daniel thrashed against the grip of the spirits, but his strength was nothing compared to theirs. They dragged him onto the stone, and the air filled with a sound like tearing fabric, as if the veil between worlds had split wide open. The shadow descended upon him. His body arched. His screams rose to the heavens, and then silence. A silence so complete it was heavier than sound itself. When it lifted, Daniel was gone. Only ashes remained on the altar, and the whispers of the spirits faded into the night. The light around Amara slowly dimmed, leaving her in the stillness of the clearing. The shrine was broken, the ground scarred, but she was alive. She fell to the earth, shaking, overwhelmed by the weight of what she had witnessed. In the distance, the sound of night returned, the chirping of crickets, the hooting of owls, the rustling of leaves. Life moved on, as if nothing had happened, but Amara knew she had walked through the valley of death and returned. The forest no longer frightened her. The true terror had been in the heart of the one she loved. And though he was gone, the wound of his betrayal remained. She rose slowly, her body weak but her spirit unbroken. She did not know how she would leave the forest, or how she would explain what had happened, but she knew one thing for certain. Daniel's story was a warning, not just to her, but to all who let greed blind their hearts. And as she stumbled back onto the path that led out of the woods, she realized her journey was far from over. The town awaited her return, but the truth she carried would shake the very ground beneath those who thought wealth could come without consequence. The night had claimed its sacrifice, but the morning would reveal its lessons. The forest loomed behind her like a shadow she would never forget, but Amara pressed forward, her steps unsteady, her spirit heavy with grief and disbelief. The path was long, and the night seemed endless, yet something guided her feet. The memory of light still lingered, pushing her onward, keeping her from collapsing beneath the weight of fear. When at last the faint outline of houses appeared in the distance, she nearly fell from relief. She was bruised, exhausted, and trembling, but she had escaped the jaws of death. The town that once felt ordinary now looked different, almost alien. Every flickering lantern, every barking dog, every voice carried a strange sharpness. She had seen what lay behind the veil of greed and ritual, and nothing would ever be the same again. At dawn, the first villagers to see her were shocked. Her clothes were torn, her face pale, her steps slow. They rushed to her, asking questions, but she could not answer at first. Her lips trembled, her eyes glassy, as though she had returned from a place where words had no meaning. They carried her home, murmuring prayers, and by midday the entire community was speaking of her. Whispers spread quickly. Daniel had taken her away, and now she had returned alone. Where was he? What had happened in the forest? Amara's family wept with relief when they saw her alive. They held her close, though she sat silently, staring into the distance. It took hours before her voice returned, and when it did, it was slow, fragile, like a child learning to speak again. She told them pieces of the truth, how Daniel had led her to a place of darkness, how men of shadows had demanded her life, how the earth itself had trembled with judgment. But she did not reveal every detail, for the weight of what she had seen was too heavy to share all at once. Still, what she said was enough. The news struck the town like a storm. People gathered in groups, murmuring with disbelief, outrage, and fear. Some refused to believe that Daniel, who had once walked among them with a smile, could commit such betrayal. Others shook their heads knowingly, whispering that they had seen the signs, his greed, his strange associations, his restless ambition. A few grew silent, their eyes darting nervously, for they too had tasted the lure of wealth gained in unnatural ways. Daniel's family was thrown into shame. His mother wept loudly, refusing to accept that her son could vanish so completely. His father hid behind closed doors, unwilling to face the questions that battered their home. Brothers and cousins argued, some insisting Daniel must have been tricked, others confessing that he had always longed for riches without work. The priest who had led him into the forest was nowhere to be found. He had vanished into the night, like smoke, leaving no trace. Some claimed they saw him heading toward distant villages. Others whispered that the spirits themselves had devoured him for failing to deliver the sacrifice. Whatever the truth, he was gone. Amara, though shaken, began to recover slowly. The warmth of her family, the prayers of neighbors, and the comfort of ordinary life helped her regain her strength. Yet deep inside, she carried scars invisible to the eye. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's face, first with the charm that had once made her love him, then with the cold mask of betrayal, and finally with the terror of one dragged into judgment. His screams echoed in her mind, not as pity, but as a reminder of the price of greed. The town, too, began to shift. People spoke less openly about the quick wealth others flaunted. Those who had dabbled in secret practices grew cautious, fearful that Daniel's fate might be theirs. Mothers warned their daughters more sternly. Fathers reminded their sons of the dangers of chasing shadows. The story spread beyond the town, carried by traders and travelers, until neighboring communities whispered of it as a warning. The man who wanted to sacrifice his love, but was himself consumed. But not everyone took the lesson to heart. In the corners of the market, in hidden gatherings, some still whispered with envy. They asked if Daniel had simply made a mistake, if the ritual had gone wrong, if perhaps with stronger courage he might have succeeded. They longed for the same riches he had sought, blind to the ashes he had left behind. Amara noticed these whispers, and they disturbed her deeply. She realized that the battle was not over. Greed was like a sickness in the land, and though Daniel had fallen, others were still tempted. She could not remain silent. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she gathered her courage and spoke to the people. She told them her story fully, without hesitation, sparing no detail. She described the shrine, the priest, the shadow, the voices of the spirits, and the fate that swallowed Daniel whole. She spoke of the light that shielded her, the unseen hand that pulled her back from the pit. Her voice trembled at times, but her words were clear. She told them that no wealth gained through blood would ever last, that the spirits who promised riches were deceivers, who consumed even those who served them. She warned them that betrayal was the seed of destruction, and greed the chain that dragged souls into darkness. The crowd was silent as she spoke. Some wept quietly, others bowed their heads. A few turned away, their faces hard, unwilling to abandon the lure of shortcuts. But many listened, and her words sank deep. From that night onward, Amara became more than just a survivor. She was a living testimony, a warning, a voice that reminded the people that life was more precious than gold, and that love should never be traded for wealth. Children grew up hearing her story, and mothers pointed to her as proof that betrayal never ends well. Yet despite her courage, Amara carried her pain in private. She had loved Daniel once, and the wound of his betrayal was not easily healed. At night, she sometimes dreamed of him again, but no longer as the man she had cherished. Instead, she saw him wandering in darkness, reaching for riches that crumbled in his hands, crying out for mercy that never came. She prayed for his soul, though she did not know if mercy was possible for one who had walked so far into the shadows. Time moved on. Seasons changed. The town returned to its rhythms of trade, farming, and festivals. But beneath the surface, the story of Daniel lingered like a scar, a reminder carved into the memory of all who had lived through it. And though the priest was gone, and Daniel's ashes had scattered into the earth, the spirits he had once summoned were not entirely silent. In the dead of night, deep in the forest where the shrine had crumbled, strange sounds were still heard, whispers that carried on the wind, shadows that shifted among the trees. Hunters spoke of seeing figures that vanished when approached, and travelers avoided the path altogether. It seemed that though one man had fallen, the covenant of blood had left its stain upon the land. Amara's story was not the end. It was only the beginning of a greater battle between light and darkness, between greed and truth. And as another season approached, the forest waited, watching, for the next soul bold, or foolish, enough to step into its cursed clearing. The town tried to return to normal life, but the memory of Daniel's betrayal refused to fade. His name became a shadow that hung over conversations, whispered with fear and disgust. Mothers used his story to warn their sons, telling them that wealth born from blood could never bring peace. Fathers pointed to the forest, reminding their children that some paths must never be walked. Yet as weeks passed, the weight of fear began to loosen. Human hearts are fickle, quick to forget the lessons carved by tragedy. Some said Amara had exaggerated, that perhaps Daniel had simply vanished into the world of secret wealth, and would return one day in fine clothes, driving cars none of them had ever seen. Others argued that she was too emotional, her story too dramatic to be entirely true. And then there were those who remembered every detail, but allowed envy to speak louder than wisdom. They thought of Daniel's boldness, of how close he had come to success, and they wondered if perhaps his mistake was only hesitation. If he had not faltered, would he not have been rich beyond measure? Greed, like a poison, seeped quietly back into the hearts of some. Amara sensed it. She watched the faces of people when she spoke in gatherings, when she told her story in markets or on street corners. Some listened with tears, others with indifference, but a few with eyes that glittered, not with fear, but with curiosity. It chilled her more than the memory of the forest itself, for she knew greed was not so easily defeated. It only hid for a while, waiting for a new vessel. At night, Amara often dreamed of the forest. The whispers returned, faint at first, then louder, calling names she did not recognize. She would wake drenched in sweat, her heart racing, certain that the spirits had not been silenced. They lingered in the cracks of the earth, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to summon them. And she was right. One evening, in a nearby village, a young man named Chike sat with a group of friends. They drank palm wine and spoke boldly of wealth. They mocked the poor, scoffed at patience, and praised those who had risen suddenly into fortune. Daniel's story was mentioned, but not as a warning. They twisted it into a challenge. Chike claimed Daniel had lacked courage, that he had failed because he hesitated, that he had chosen a weak sacrifice. If it had been him, he boasted, he would not have faltered. The others laughed and encouraged him, and pride filled his chest. In his heart, envy had already taken root. He longed for houses, lands, and power, and he believed he was destined for more than the slow toil of farming and trading. Chike sought out men who trafficked in secrets, He asked questions in hushed tones, lingered in markets for rumors, and at last, he found a path that led him toward the same forest where Daniel had vanished. But the forest remembered. The shrine still stood in ruins, yet the air there was thick with shadows. The spirits had been angered, denied their satisfaction, and though they had devoured Daniel, their hunger remained unsatisfied. When Chike arrived, guided by whispers and by his own greed, the ground itself seemed to welcome him with a low, rumbling sigh. He brought with him a girl, just as Daniel had once done. She was young, innocent, unaware of the doom that awaited her. Chike believed he was strong enough, determined enough, to succeed where Daniel had failed. He stepped into the clearing boldly, calling upon the spirits. And the spirits answered. The shadow rose again, its countless eyes glowing in the darkness. The ruined shrine trembled, as though eager for new blood. But as they looked upon Chike, they did not rejoice. Instead, they laughed, a sound that scraped against the bones. For they remembered Daniel. The spirits knew human greed well. They had fed on it for centuries, turning man against woman, brother against brother, father against child. But this boy, this Chike, was no different from the last. His boldness was only another mask for weakness, his pride another doorway for fear. They welcomed him not as a master, but as prey. The girl screamed, struggling to break free, but the forest swallowed her cries. Chike tried to silence her, to bind her, to offer her as he had promised. But just as Daniel had faced before him, a power greater than darkness intervened. The air grew heavy, and the light that had once shielded Amara flickered again, faint but present. The spirits recoiled, hissing in frustration, for they could not touch innocence, shielded by faith. Their hunger turned instead toward Chike. His confidence melted into terror. He remembered the stories he had laughed at, the warnings he had ignored, the fate of Daniel he had mocked. But it was too late. The spirits closed in, dragging him toward the cracked stones of the shrine. His screams tore through the night, echoing into the village, though no one dared to follow. By dawn, he was gone. The girl stumbled out of the forest, trembling, shaken, but alive. Her eyes wide with horror, she told the village what had happened. And once again, the story spread like wildfire. Another man had sought riches in the forest, and another had been swallowed. Amara heard the news and wept, not for Chike, whose arrogance had destroyed him, but for the endless cycle of greed. She realized the curse was not just in the forest, but in the hearts of men who refused to learn. The town grew restless again. Fear deepened, but so did suspicion. Some said Amara herself was tied to the strange light that protected victims. Others whispered that the spirits were not finished, that they would return again and again until their hunger was fully satisfied. At night, the whispers in the forest grew louder. Travelers avoided the road. Hunters abandoned the nearby woods. A sense of dread hung over the land, a weight that pressed upon every heart. The curse had not ended with Daniel. It had only spread its roots deeper, waiting for more. Amara prayed harder, seeking strength not just for herself, but for her people. She knew she had been spared for a reason, that her survival was more than chance. Yet she also knew she could not fight this battle alone. The spirits were patient. They knew another would come. The question was not if, but when. And as the moon rose full above the cursed forest, the shadows stretched long, whispering promises of gold and power to any ear foolish enough to listen. The village grew weary of fear. Every story of the forest deepened their unease, yet no one could silence the lure of riches whispered by shadows. Some had learned, but others, blinded by envy, continued to imagine themselves braver, smarter, stronger than the ones who had fallen. Amara felt the weight of it pressing on her soul. She walked the paths of the village daily, reminding children to keep close to home, warning men not to chase shortcuts, urging women to guard their families against greedy schemes. But her voice, though honest and heavy with experience, was not enough. Greed was a seed that sprouted quickly in hungry hearts, and no word seemed sharp enough to uproot it. One night, she dreamt again of the forest. Only this time, it was not Daniel's face that haunted her, nor Chike's cries that echoed. She saw instead a gathering of shadows, swelling larger than ever before, stretching beyond the forest into the village itself. She woke trembling, for the meaning was clear. The spirits would not stay confined. Their hunger had grown. The next morning, the ground trembled faintly beneath her feet. Cracks spread through the earth near the edge of the forest, and an unnatural wind howled through the trees. The elders of the village gathered, fearful, uncertain. They whispered of curses too old to break, of gods too angry to appease. Some urged everyone to flee, to abandon their homes before the darkness swallowed them whole. But Amara refused to run. She knew her survival had not been for nothing. Twice the spirits had been denied. Twice their chosen sacrifices had been spared by a light stronger than their darkness. That light had not come from her, but it had chosen her as its witness. Perhaps, she thought, it had chosen her as its vessel. That night, she went alone to the edge of the cursed forest. The air was heavy, thick with whispers that scratched against her skin. Her body trembled, but her heart held firm. She carried no offering, no victim, no fear to feed the spirits. She carried only faith and the stubborn will to end what Daniel had begun. The forest received her with mocking laughter. The trees creaked and groaned, bending as though alive, their branches clawing at the night sky. From the ruins of the shrine, shadows began to rise, coiling like snakes, twisting into monstrous forms. Countless eyes blinked open in the dark, glowing with greed and hunger. They remembered her. She was the one who had escaped, the one they had been denied. Their voices merged into a storm of rage, calling her name, accusing her of theft, of defiance. They promised her wealth, power, anything she desired, if only she would surrender to them. But Amara stood her ground. She spoke not to them, but to the heavens. Her words were not shouted, but whispered with conviction, her lips moving in prayer. Her heart poured out every fear, every sorrow, every hope. She asked not for riches, nor for revenge, but for deliverance, for herself, for her village, for every soul ensnared by the lies of greed. The spirits shrieked, their laughter twisting into fury. The ground split wider, and from the cracks, hands of shadow reached out, clawing at her feet, trying to drag her down. The air stank of rot, and the weight of darkness pressed so heavy she could scarcely breathe. And then, as before, the light appeared. It was faint at first, a flicker in the darkness, like the glow of a single candle against a storm. But as Amara's prayer deepened, it grew, spreading through her body, radiating from her chest until her entire form blazed with golden fire. The hands of shadow recoiled, hissing in pain. The monstrous forms writhed and twisted, their countless eyes burning away one by one. The ruined shrine crumbled further, stones splitting and collapsing under the weight of the light. The forest shook, trees snapping as though struck by invisible force. The voices of the spirits rose in one last wail, a cry of hunger denied, before they shattered like glass, scattering into the night. The ground closed over the cracks. The air cleared. The forest fell silent. Amara collapsed to her knees, exhausted, trembling, but alive. Around her, the clearing glowed faintly, no longer with shadow, but with peace. The shrine was gone, reduced to rubble. The whispers had vanished. The curse, for now, was broken. When she returned to the village, the people gathered in awe. They saw the glow still lingering faintly around her, the strength in her weary eyes. They listened as she told them what had happened, how the spirits had been banished by faith and truth. For the first time, they believed fully, not because of fear, but because they had seen the light reflected in her. From that day forward, the story of Daniel was no longer just a warning of greed, nor a tale of horror whispered to frightened children. It became a lesson woven into the fabric of the village. Mothers told it to their daughters, fathers to their sons, not with trembling but with determination. It was the story of how greed destroys, and how courage and faith can save. Amara became more than a survivor. She became a guide, a living testimony that no wealth gained by blood could ever bring peace. She taught the young to seek patience, to value hard work, to resist shortcuts that led only to ruin. And though the memory of Daniel's betrayal remained, it no longer held the power to terrify. It had been transformed into wisdom. The forest, once cursed, began slowly to heal. The birds returned, the trees grew straight and tall again, and the hunters dared once more to walk its edges. Though none entered the ruined shrine, its silence was proof that the darkness had been driven out. Yet Amara never forgot. She knew greed was not bound by the forest alone. It lived in the hearts of men and women everywhere, always waiting for an open door. The spirits might return someday, in another form, in another place, to another fool who believed themselves stronger than the truth. But for now, her people were safe. She would watch. She would teach. She would remind them, again and again, that no shadow is stronger than the light, and no hunger worth more than a soul. And so the tale ended, not with riches, not with glory, but with wisdom carved through pain. The story of Daniel, the man who sought to use his girlfriend for money ritual, but was himself devoured, became a legend told for generations. And in every telling, the listeners learned the same truth, that greed always consumes itself,